Montana, 1925. The late autumn sun cast long shadows across the porch of an aging ranch house. Jackson Morgan, now 75, rocked slowly in his weathered chair, his leathered hands resting on knees that had seen decades of hard work. Deep valleys lined his sun-bronzed face, each wrinkle a testament to years spent under the Montana sky. His eyes, still sharp blue despite his age, gazed across the prosperous cattle ranch that stretched before him. 3,000 acres of rolling hills, grazing pastures, and golden wheat fields ready for harvest. Beside him, his 8-year-old granddaughter Emily sat cross-legged on the wooden planks, her eyes wide with anticipation. The electric lights from the main house glowed behind them, a modern convenience that still amazed Jackson after all these years. In the distance, 2 automobiles kicked up dust along the road leading to the main barn, where ranch hands prepared for evening chores. "Tell me again, Grandpa," Emily urged, twisting a blonde braid around her finger. "About the snowstorm, about how you found Grandma." Jackson smiled, the deep lines around his eyes crinkling. His voice, though roughened by age, carried the strength of a man who had stories worth telling. He glanced toward the family cemetery on the low hill beyond the south pasture, where his beloved wife now rested. "Montana was different back then," he began, his voice dropping to the storytelling cadence that Emily loved. "No automobiles, no telephones, no electric lights, just open country, stretching farther than the eye could see. When winter came, it isolated you completely. A man had to be self-sufficient or he didn't survive." Emily nodded solemnly. Though surrounded by modern conveniences of 1925, she understood the heritage of hardship that had built their family's prosperity. "It was the winter of 1885, Jackson continued. "The coldest in 50 years, they said. Temperatures down to 30 below. The kind of cold that turns your breath to ice before it leaves your mouth. The railroad had only reached Fort Thompson 2 years earlier. The territory wouldn't even become a state for another 4 years." As he spoke, the ranch house around them seemed to fade. The rolling hills of their prosperous cattle ranch, the automobiles in the distance, the electric lights visible through the window, all melted away. In their place came the howling winds and blinding snow of a Montana winter 4 decades past. February 1885. A wall of white obliterated the landscape. Jackson Morgan, then 35, leaned into the bitter wind, his horse Thunder struggling to move forward through snow that reached past the stirrups. His beard was crusted with ice. His eyes narrowed to slits against the blinding white. Any sane man would have remained indoors on such a day, but Jackson had never claimed sanity as his virtue. He'd been checking the new steel fence line he'd installed that autumn, a modern improvement over the traditional wooden posts that couldn't withstand Montana's brutal seasonal shifts. The Glidden barbed wire, patented just 11 years earlier, had cost him nearly a month's profits, but would save him countless hours repairing broken fences after winter storms. Jackson had always been one to embrace practical innovations, even when other ranchers mocked his Eastern notions. Beneath him, Thunder wore special horseshoes with cleated edges for better traction in snow. Another of Jackson's adaptations that had raised eyebrows initially but was now copied by others. The Big Bay gelding had been his faithful companion for 7 years, chosen specifically for his broad chest and sturdy legs, ideal for navigating Montana's challenging terrain. Jackson wore 4 layers against the cold: wool undergarments, a flannel shirt, a deerskin vest lined with sheepskin, and his heavy buffalo coat. His hands were protected by rabbit fur mittens with leather palms. Around his face, he'd wrapped a wool scarf, leaving only his eyes exposed. On his head sat a beaver fur hat with ear flaps tied securely under his chin. Even with these precautions, the cold found ways to bite at his flesh. The temperature had plummeted to 30 below zero by midday. Jackson had learned to read the subtle signs of dangerous weather during his time as a scout in the Civil War, and everything about the current conditions warned him to seek shelter. Yet he pressed on, needing to check one final section of fence where wolves had been getting through to his winter calving pasture. Thunder suddenly tossed his head, ears pricking forward, nostrils flaring. The horse had caught something on the wind, something beyond the endless howl of the blizzard. Jackson patted the animal's neck with a gloved hand. "What is it, boy?" 20 yards ahead, a dark shape emerged from the swirling white. At first, it appeared to be nothing more than a snow-covered boulder, But as Jackson urged thunder closer, details clarified. A wagon, overturned and half buried in a drift. Its wooden frame jutted from the snow like the ribs of some fallen beast. Jackson dismounted, his feet crunching into snow that reached his knees. He approached cautiously, one hand on the Colt revolver at his hip. Years on the frontier had taught him wariness. The wagon was a Conestoga, built for the long journey west. Its canvas cover was torn and flapping wildly in the wind. The rear axle had snapped clean through, suggesting a catastrophic failure rather than a simple overturn. From the position of the wagon and the pattern of the drift, Jackson estimated it had been there at least 3 days, possibly since the blizzard began. He examined the snow around it, noting the absence of tracks. No one had visited the site since the accident. "Hello?" Jackson called, his voice swallowed by the storm. "Anyone alive?" The silence that answered told him what he'd find before he reached it. Near the wagon, partially covered by snow, lay 2 bodies. A man and a woman, frozen in death's embrace. The man was face down, one arm outstretched toward the woman as if reaching for her even in death. The woman was on her back, eyes closed, her features peaceful despite the violent end she'd met. Jackson removed his hat despite the cold, a gesture of respect for the dead. They were young, perhaps in their 30s. The man wore the rough clothes of a homesteader, but his boots were of good quality, suggesting he wasn't without means. The woman's dress, once fine, was now tattered and bloodied at the hem. Around her neck hung a silver cross on a delicate chain. Working quickly, Jackson examined the scene with the methodical eye of a man accustomed to reading stories in the smallest details. The wagon's contents were scattered: clothes, cooking utensils, a cracked mirror, a Bible with water-stained pages. He found a broken lantern, its glass shattered, the oil long since frozen. The disaster had likely occurred at night, perhaps with the lantern overturning during the crash and igniting the canvas briefly before the snow extinguished the flames. With no tools to dig proper graves in the frozen ground, Jackson performed a frontier burial. He placed the bodies side by side, covered them with a tarp from the wagon, and weighted it with stones to prevent scavengers from disturbing them. He placed the man's 2 Colt revolvers in the shape of a cross over the makeshift grave. The weapons were high-quality Navy Colts, further evidence that the couple had been people of some standing. "Lord, receive these souls whose names I do not know," he murmured, the prayer freezing in the air before him. "Grant them peace they may not have found in life." As he worked, a sound reached him, faint, almost imperceptible beneath the howling wind, a rustle from beneath the wagon's overturned bed. Jackson froze, listening intently, years of frontier survival having honed his senses to detect even the slightest anomaly. There it came again, a soft sound, like fabric shifting. Jackson dropped to his knees, peering into the dark space beneath the splintered wood. There, wrapped in a woolen blanket, lay a child. A girl no more than 7 years old, her face as pale as the snow around her, lips blue from cold, but alive. Her eyes were open, staring at him without tears, without sound. In her small hands, she clutched a carved wooden horse. "Lord Almighty," Jackson whispered. She should have been dead. 3 days in this cold, maybe more, would kill a grown man, let alone a child. Yet somehow she breathed, shallow, labored breaths that formed tiny clouds in the frigid air. Her survival defied explanation. Perhaps the overturned wagon bed had created a small pocket protected from the worst of the elements. Or perhaps something stronger than physics had kept her alive. Jackson didn't hesitate. He removed his heavy buffalo coat and wrapped it around the child, lifting her into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, a fragile bundle of bones and frozen flesh. Her eyes never left his face, watching him with a wary animal stillness. He recognized that look, had seen it in wounded creatures and traumatized soldiers alike. Fear mingled with desperate hope. As he held her, memories surfaced unbidden. His son Thomas had been about her size when fever took him 5 winters ago. The same delicate shoulders, the same vulnerability. Jackson pushed the thought away. This child lived and needed him now. "I'll be your father," he said quietly. It wasn't a question. It was a vow, spoken with the same certainty as the one he'd made at his wedding altar years before. The child didn't respond verbally, but her frozen fingers gripped the edge of his coat in what might have been acknowledgement. Jackson assessed her condition with the field medicine knowledge he'd gained during the war. Severe hypothermia, certainly, but no apparent frostbite yet. Her extremities were pale but not blackened. Her breathing was shallow but regular. She needed warmth, fluids, and shelter immediately. He settled her in front of him on the saddle, his arm tight around her small frame. She shivered violently but made no sound. Behind them, shadows moved through the blinding snow. Wolves closing in on the scent of death. But the girl was beyond their reach now. "Hang on, little one," he murmured against her ear. "We'll be home soon." The storm intensified as they rode toward his cabin, 3 miles through the deepening snow. Jackson hunched over the child, using his body to shield her from the wind's fury. Without his buffalo coat, the cold cut through his remaining layers like knives, but he welcomed the pain. Pain meant life, and as long as he felt it, he could keep fighting. He spoke to her continuously, a stream of reassurances that she probably couldn't hear over the howling blizzard. "Stay with me, little one. Cabin's not far. Got a fire waiting. You'll be warm soon. Just hold on." The journey that normally took 40 minutes stretched to nearly 2 hours as thunder struggled through snowdrifts that sometimes reached his chest. Jackson navigated by instinct and familiarity with the land, unable to see more than a few yards ahead in any direction. The cold seeped into his bones and his hands grew numb on the reins, but he kept the child pressed against his chest, transferring what body heat he could spare. His homestead appeared as a dark smudge against the white curtain of snow. The main cabin stood centered on his 160 acres, claimed under the Homestead Act of 1862 when Jackson had moved west after the war. He had built it himself, a simple log structure, 10 feet by 12, with a small covered porch fronting the entrance and a stone chimney rising from the peaked roof. Constructed from lodgepole pine logged from the mountains to the west, the cabin featured dovetail notching at the corners, a technique Jackson had learned from an old German carpenter in Michigan. The roof was steep to prevent snow accumulation, and the walls were chinked with a mixture of clay, lime, and horsehair for insulation. Currently, the chimney emitted no smoke. Jackson had let the fire die down before leaving that morning, not expecting to return with company. 20 yards to the north stood a sturdy barn where Thunder and 2 other horses sheltered along with Jackson's small herd of winter cattle. A chicken coop, smokehouse, and outhouse completed the modest homestead, everything built by his own hands over 7 years of solitary labor. Inside, the cabin was cold as a tomb. Jackson moved with practiced efficiency. He laid the girl on his bed, wrapped in every blanket he owned. Working quickly, he kindled a fire in the stone fireplace, feeding it until flames roared up the chimney. From a drawer beneath his bed, he retrieved extra candles, lighting them to add both illumination and a small measure of warmth. He heated rocks in the fire, then wrapped them in cloth and placed them under the blankets beside the child's frozen body. It was a technique he'd learned from an army surgeon during the Battle of Gettysburg, the most effective way to slowly raise the core temperature of a hypothermia victim without the shock of direct heat. The cabin was sparse but meticulously maintained. One room containing a bed, a table with 2 chairs, a small bookshelf, and a cast iron stove. Various tools hung from pegs on the walls. A rifle rested on brackets above the door. Everything had its place, reflecting the ordered mind of a man who had learned that survival required discipline. 2 items stood out among the practical furnishings. A woman's shawl hung on a peg by the door, untouched for 5 years, the deep blue wool still vibrant against the weathered logs. And in the corner, covered by a sheet, sat a small wooden cradle, lovingly crafted from cherry wood with intricate carvings along the sides. Jackson had met Sarah Miller in 1872, 3 years after claiming his homestead. She was the school teacher in Fort Thompson, a Pennsylvania girl who had come west seeking adventure and independence. Their courtship had been brief but sincere, 2 strong-willed individuals recognizing in each other the qualities needed to survive on the frontier. They married in the spring of 1873. Thomas arrived 2 years later, a robust boy with his mother's gentle eyes and his father's determined jaw. Jackson had such plans for him, teaching him to ride, to hunt, to become the kind of man who could build something lasting in this harsh land. The cradle had been Jackson's wedding gift to Sarah, crafted during the long winter evenings before their wedding. each carving a promise of the family they would build. The fever came in December 1880. First Sarah, then Thomas. Jackson had ridden through another blizzard much like today's, desperate to fetch the doctor from Fort Thompson. But the journey took too long. By the time he returned with medical help, both were beyond saving. They died within hours of each other, leaving Jackson alone with the cabin he had built for a family that no longer existed. As the cabin slowly warmed, Jackson melted snow for water and prepared a thin broth on the stove. He removed the girl's frozen boots and sodden stockings, checking her feet for frostbite. The skin was white and waxy but not yet blackened. There was hope. He knelt beside the bed and tried to coax her to drink the broth. "You need this," he said gently. "Just a little." She turned her face away. When he lifted the spoon toward her, she flinched as if expecting a blow. Jackson froze, recognition dawning in his eyes. He had seen that reaction before, in cavalry horses that had been mistreated, in dogs that had been beaten. This child expected pain from adult hands. "I won't hurt you," he said. "I promise." She didn't believe him. He could see that clearly in the wariness that never left her eyes. But she was too weak to fight. He set the broth aside and offered water instead, cupped in his calloused hands. After a moment's hesitation, she drank from his palms like a wounded animal might, in desperate thirst but ready to bolt at any sudden movement. It was enough for now. Water would sustain her until she trusted him enough to accept food. Jackson had tamed wild horses with less patience than he was prepared to offer this child. As the fire crackled, throwing dancing shadows across the cabin walls, Jackson sat back and watched her. She clutched the carved wooden horse against her chest, her eyes following his every movement. Slowly, her eyelids grew heavy. She fought sleep, terror evident in the tension of her small body. But exhaustion won. When her breathing finally steadied, Jackson exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He looked around the cabin, at the dust on the shelves, the single cup by the basin, his wife's shawl that he couldn't bring himself to move. For 5 years, he had existed rather than lived, going through the motions of survival without purpose. The silence of the cabin had become his constant companion, punctuated only by the practical sounds of his solitary routines. Now, the soft breathing of the child seemed to fill the space with something he had forgotten. Possibility. "I couldn't save them," he whispered to the empty room, "but I can save you." Night passed with Jackson keeping vigil beside the bed. He stoked the fire throughout the dark hours, watching the slow rise and fall of the child's chest. The storm raged unabated, rattling the windows and moaning through the chimney like a living thing. Jackson had weathered many such nights alone, but this time felt different. He was no longer simply enduring. He was protecting. Twice during the night, the girl stirred with nightmares, whimpering in her sleep. Jackson spoke softly until she settled again, though he doubted she heard his words. It was the tone that mattered, steady, reassuring, a human connection in the darkness. Outside, beyond the cabin walls, temperatures dropped to 40 below. Wolf howls echoed across the snow-covered landscape, reminding Jackson how tenuous their safety truly was. The frontier tolerated no weakness, forgave no mistakes. Yet inside, the cabin held life, precarious but present. Dawn broke clear and cold. Jackson woke with a stiff neck, his body aching from sleeping upright in a chair. The storm had passed during the night, leaving an eerie stillness in its wake. The girl was awake, sitting up in bed, watching him. When their eyes met, she looked away quickly. "You hungry?" he asked, keeping his voice low and gentle. She didn't answer. He made oatmeal, sweetened with the last of his honey, and set the bowl beside her. She ate slowly, mechanically, never meeting his gaze. When she finished, he handed her a small cup of water, which she drank without looking at him. "We need to go back to the wagon," he said, more to himself than to her. "Need to bury your folks proper. Maybe find out who you are." Her fingers tightened on the wooden horse, but she gave no other response. Jackson busied himself with morning chores, feeding his livestock, and clearing snow from the cabin entrance. The world outside gleamed blindingly white, transformed by the blizzard into an alien landscape of drifts and shadows. The temperature had risen slightly, perhaps to 10 below zero, still dangerously cold, but manageable with proper preparation. After ensuring the cabin was warm enough, Jackson prepared for their journey. He dressed the girl in his smallest shirt, which hung on her like a tent, and wrapped her in blankets. He found a pair of wool socks, which he cut and modified to serve as mittens for her tiny hands. From a trunk beneath his bed, he retrieved a rabbit fur hat that had belonged to Thomas, adjusting the straps to fit her smaller head. "Ever been on a horse before?" he asked as he carried her to the barn where Thunder waited. She nodded slightly. "Good, you'll ride with me. Hold on tight." The journey back to the wagon took longer than expected. Fresh snow had erased their tracks, and the landscape appeared uniform in its white mantle. Jackson navigated by landmarks only a seasoned frontiersman would recognize. The shape of a distant hill, a particular bend in a half-buried creek, the silhouette of a lightning-struck pine that had served as his guide for years. The storm had passed, leaving behind a crystalline landscape. The sky stretched above them, a perfect azure unmarred by clouds. The snow-covered prairie glittered in the morning sun, beautiful and deadly. The temperature had risen to perhaps 5 below zero, still dangerous, but workable for what needed to be done. They found the wagon as he had left it, though wolves had been at the makeshift grave, forcing Jackson to rebuild it. The girl sat on Thunder's back, watching as Jackson began to dig. The ground was frozen solid, unyielding to his pickaxe. For 4 hours he labored, sweat freezing on his forehead despite the bitter cold. His shoulders burned with exertion. His hands bled through his gloves, but he didn't stop. He used techniques learned from old trappers for winter burials, building a fire first to thaw the ground, then digging quickly before it refroze. Layer by layer, he penetrated the frozen earth, creating 2 graves 6 feet deep to protect the bodies from predators in the spring thaw. When the graves were finally deep enough, Jackson placed the bodies inside. He worked with gentle reverence, straightening the man's limbs, crossing the woman's arms over her chest. Before covering them, he searched for identification. In the man's pocket, he found a folded document, a deed to land in Colorado, 320 acres near a planned Union Pacific Railway extension. The paper bore the name David Ellis and was dated October 1884. Such land would be worth perhaps $3,000, a small fortune in 1885. In the woman's dress, he discovered a locket containing a tiny portrait of the girl and an inscription, "To Elizabeth, with eternal love, D." Most valuable was a diary found in a hidden compartment in the wagon. The handwriting was feminine, the ink faded but legible. Jackson read a few pages, his expression darkening. "Rebecca," he read aloud from an entry dated just 3 weeks earlier. "My beautiful daughter turns 7 today. David carved her another horse. She collects them now. We pray we'll reach Colorado before Franklin finds us. The land is rightfully David's inheritance. Franklin's threats grow more violent. We must run." Later entries spoke of Franklin Reed, Elizabeth's brother, a businessman from St. Louis who had claimed the land deed belonged to him. The final entry chilled Jackson's blood. Franklin swore he would kill us all before letting David keep the land. I fear he means it. We travel west through the night now. Rebecca has nightmares. Dear God, protect our child. Jackson looked up at the girl who still sat motionless on the horse. "Rebecca," he said, "is that your name?" The child nodded, the first real communication between them. "Rebecca," he repeated, "that's a fine name, a strong name." He fashioned crosses from broken wagon planks and drove them into the frozen earth at the head of each grave. Then he knelt, removed his hat, and spoke a simple prayer over the final resting place of David and Elizabeth Ellis. Rebecca approached slowly, stood beside him, and placed the carved wooden horse on her mother's grave. It was the first thing she'd willingly released since he found her. Jackson waited in silence. When she was ready, he offered his hand. After a moment's hesitation, she took it, her tiny fingers disappearing into his weathered palm. They rode back toward his cabin, but Jackson turned Thunder toward town instead. Fort Thompson lay 8 miles south, a frontier settlement of 500 souls that served as an outpost of civilization in the Montana wilderness. The town had grown substantially since the Northern Pacific Railway had arrived 2 years earlier, bringing with it new businesses, settlers, and the inevitable complications of progress. Originally established as a trading post in 1801, Fort Thompson now boasted a main street lined with the false-fronted buildings, a general store, livery stable, saloon, hotel, blacksmith, and even a small school. The arrival of the railroad had transformed it from a remote outpost to a growing community with aspirations of permanence. No turning back now, Jackson muttered, as the cluster of wooden buildings appeared on the horizon. He rarely visited town, preferring the solitude of his homestead to the complexities of social interaction. The people of Fort Thompson knew him as a competent rancher who kept to himself, the quiet widower who had retreated from life after losing his family. Rebecca sat in front of him, his arm around her small body finely warm against his chest. The wind had gentled, the sky clear. Behind them, the graves disappeared into the vast white emptiness. Ahead, the town waited with its judgments and complications. Fort Thompson watched them ride in with the suspicious eyes common to frontier settlements. The main street was a rutted path of frozen mud, flanked by false-fronted buildings. People stopped to stare at the unlikely pair, a hard-eyed rancher known for his solitary ways and a girl who looked too small and fragile to have survived a Montana winter. Whispers started before they dismounted. Jackson ignored them. He had never cared for public opinion and wouldn't start now. He lifted Rebecca down and walked her to Dr. James Wilson's clinic, a small building next to the general store. The bell chimed as they entered. The doctor, a lean man with spectacles and a neatly trimmed beard, looked up from his desk. His expression shifted from surprise to concern when he saw the child. "Jackson," he said, "who's this?" "Found her by a wagon 3 days out," Jackson replied, his voice matter-of-fact despite the extraordinary nature of his discovery. "Parents dead. She needs checking." Dr. Wilson studied the pair before him, taking in Jackson's weather-worn appearance and the small girl clinging to his side. The doctor had known Jackson Morgan for 10 years, having arrived in Fort Thompson shortly after Jackson lost his wife and son. He'd witnessed the rancher's gradual withdrawal from society, the way grief had hardened into solitude. Now, seeing him with this child, Wilson noted a subtle change in the man's bearing, a protective stance he hadn't displayed in years. "Of course," he said, gesturing to the examination table. "Bring her over." Rebecca hesitated, her small hand tightening in Jackson's. Fear flickered across her face as she eyed the medical instruments arranged on a nearby tray. Jackson knelt to her level, bringing his weathered face close to hers. "Dr. Wilson needs to make sure you're all right," he explained quietly. "I'll be right here. Won't let anything happen to you." The girl searched his eyes, then gave a barely perceptible nod. Jackson lifted her onto the examination table, his hand remaining on her shoulder as the doctor approached. Wilson's clinic represented the frontier's tenuous connection to modern medicine. The small room contained an examination table, cabinets filled with medicines and bandages, and shelves lined with medical texts. A coal stove in the corner maintained a comfortable warmth that contrasted with the bitter cold outside. Though modest by Eastern standards, the clinic was a marvel of civilization for a territory town like Fort Thompson. Dr. Wilson was gentle, his movements careful and predictable as he examined the child. He checked her temperature, listened to her lungs with his stethoscope, and examined her extremities for signs of frostbite. His experienced hands probed for broken bones or internal injuries, while his keen eyes noted details that told a story beyond the immediate emergency. "Malnourished," he said quietly to Jackson. "Some old bruising on her arms and back, predating the accident by weeks, possibly months." He glanced meaningfully at Jackson, communicating his suspicion of previous abuse. "Touch of frostbite on the toes, but she'll keep 'em. Mild hypothermia, but her core temperature is stabilizing." He straightened, genuine admiration in his voice. "Remarkably resilient child. You saved her life, bringing her in when you did." "I'm keeping her," Jackson said, the words emerging with the same certainty as when he'd made his vow in the snowdrift. Dr. Wilson's eyebrows rose. "Keeping her?" "That's right." Before the doctor could respond, the door opened, bringing with it a blast of cold air and the imposing figure of Sheriff Walter Cooper. The lawman stepped inside, removing his hat, his sharp eyes taking in the scene. Cooper was a formidable presence, standing 6 feet 3 inches with broad shoulders and a thick gray-streaked beard. A former Union cavalry officer, he carried himself with military bearing even 15 years after the war. "Heard you found a girl," the sheriff said, without preamble. "I did." Jackson's reply was equally direct. The two men had a relationship built on mutual respect but little warmth, fellow veterans who recognized each other's competence without necessarily seeking friendship. Where'd she come from? Wagon overturned 3 days north. Parents froze to death. I buried them this morning. And you just took her? Cooper's tone was professional rather than accusatory, but the question itself carried weight. Jackson's jaw tightened. Was I supposed to leave her? You got any proof who she is? Any papers? Jackson produced the diary he'd found in the wagon. Found her mother's diary. Name's Rebecca Ellis. Family was running from someone, her uncle seems like. Man named Franklin Reed from St. Louis. Was after land they owned in Colorado. Sheriff Cooper took the diary, flipping through it with practiced efficiency. His frown deepened as he read passages describing the threats against the Ellis family. Sounds like trouble, Jackson. You sure you want to get involved? Already am. The sheriff sighed heavily, removing his spectacles and pinching the bridge of his nose. You can't just take in a child. There are procedures. Montana Territory has laws about orphaned minors. Orphanage in Helena would be the proper place for her. She's not going to an orphanage. Jackson's tone left no room for debate. You got legal right to her? I got the right that I saved her life. That count? Rebecca, who had been silent throughout the examination and subsequent conversation, suddenly stepped closer to Jackson, gripped his hand. Her voice was small but clear, startling everyone in the room. Don't send me away. Please. The room went silent. Sheriff Cooper looked at her, then at Jackson. The hard lines of his face softened slightly. Cooper had 2 daughters of his own, now grown and living in Helena. The plea of a frightened child was not something he could easily dismiss. This ain't simple, Morgan. People will talk. Single man taking in a young girl raises questions. Let them talk. Jackson's reputation for honesty was well established, even if his sociability was not. Before the sheriff could argue further, the door opened again. Martha Jenkins stepped inside, a sturdy widow who ran the general store next door. In her 50s, with gray-streaked brown hair and intelligent eyes, Mrs. Jenkins was a force of nature in Fort Thompson. Her husband had been the town's first shopkeeper, establishing the Mercantile in 1870 before dying of pneumonia in 1879. Since then, she had run the business with remarkable success, becoming one of the most respected voices in the community. She surveyed the scene with shrewd eyes, then folded her arms across her ample bosom. Couldn't help overhearing, she said, though the clinic's walls made this claim dubious at best. Seems to me there's a child who needs a home, and a good man offering one. Mrs. Jenkins, Sheriff Cooper acknowledged with a nod, this isn't your concern. I'm making it my concern. Jackson Morgan has been in this territory 10 years, she said firmly. Never caused trouble, never lied, never shirked a duty. If he says he'll care for that girl, he will. Better his home than some cold institution in Helena where she's just a number. The law has procedures, Cooper began. The law also has common sense, Mrs. Jenkins interrupted. Or it should. That child needs a home, not a dormitory. You know as well as I do what happens to pretty little girls in those places. She lowered her voice, though Rebecca could still hear. My cousin worked at the Helena orphanage. Things happen there. No child should endure. Sheriff Cooper looked uncomfortable at this reference to unpleasant realities. He studied Jackson for a long moment, weighing options in his mind. All right, he finally said. Temporary custody, pending proper investigation of her family. 1 month. But if there's any trouble, any questions about your fitness as guardian, you come to me first. Understood? Understood. I'll need to send inquiries to San Louis about this Franklin Reed character. If he's her legal next of kin, that complicates matters. Jackson nodded, though his expression hardened at the mention of Reed. The diary entries had made clear the man's threatening behavior toward Rebecca's family. Any legal claim Reed might have would be countered by strong evidence of his unsuitability. One more thing, Cooper added. Judge Williams will be circuit riding through Fort Thompson in 3 weeks. You'll need to appear before him to formalize any custody arrangement. Be prepared to answer questions about your means and ability to care for a child. They left the clinic and walked to the general store, Rebecca's small hand still firmly in Jackson's. Mrs. Jenkins followed, her presence a shield against the curious stares of townspeople gathering on the boardwalk. News traveled quickly in a town the size of Fort Thompson. and the sight of Jackson Morgan with a child was novelty enough to draw attention. Inside the store, shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, stocked with everything from canned goods to tools, fabrics to firearms. A pot-bellied stove occupied the center of the room, surrounded by chairs where men often gathered to exchange news and gossip. Today the chairs were empty, but the warmth of the stove was welcome after the clinic's more clinical atmosphere. Jackson bought Rebecca a dress, boots, and a peppermint stick. The girl clutched the candy-like treasure, her first possession besides the wooden horse she'd left on her mother's grave. Mrs. Jenkins added a hairbrush, ribbon, and a small blanket stitched with flower patterns. "On the house," she said when Jackson reached for his wallet. "That child deserves some pretty things after what she's been through." Mrs. Jenkins had a 9-year-old daughter of her own, Sarah, who was currently at the town's one-room schoolhouse. She packed a bundle of her daughter's outgrown clothes for Rebecca, adding them to Jackson's purchases. Simple dresses, but clean and sturdy, should fit her well enough until you can get proper ones made. As Jackson lifted Rebecca onto Thunder for the ride home, Mrs. Jenkins touched his arm. "You'll need help, Jackson. Raising a girl isn't like breaking horses. I'll manage." "I don't doubt it, but my offer stands. Sarah would welcome a friend her age. Bring Rebecca by whenever you like, and if you need advice on womanly matters as she grows, well, I'm here for that too." Jackson nodded, uncomfortable but grateful. He hadn't considered the long-term implications of raising a female child. His experience with children was limited to his son, who had barely reached his 5th birthday before the fever took him. The challenges of guiding a girl to womanhood were beyond his experience. On the ride home, the sun was setting, painting the snow-covered prairie in shades of pink and gold. Rebecca leaned back against Jackson's chest, her breathing even for the first time since he'd found her. The candy was still clutched in her hand, untasted, too precious to consume immediately. "Thank you," she whispered. So softly he almost missed it beneath the rhythmic crunch of Thunder's hooves through snow. Jackson's throat tightened unexpectedly. "You're welcome, Rebecca." They were the first words she had spoken directly to him, an acknowledgement of trust tentatively offered. Jackson Morgan, who had built his life around silence and solitude after losing his family, felt something shift inside his chest. A door long closed creaking open. The cabin came into view as dusk deepened. Smoke rose from the chimney. Mrs. Jenkins had sent one of her boys ahead to light the fire and prepare the cabin for their return. A simple kindness that spoke volumes about the community Jackson had kept at arm's length for years. Inside, the cabin was warm. A pot of stew simmered on the stove, filling the space with savory aromas. On the table sat a small rag doll, another of Mrs. Jenkins' thoughtful additions. The cabin, unchanged for 5 years, suddenly seemed inadequate to Jackson. A single room might suffice for a solitary man, but a child, especially a girl, needed privacy, space of her own. As Rebecca stood clutching her new doll, Jackson made a mental inventory of the changes needed. A partition for a separate sleeping area, a proper washstand, shelves for her belongings, a larger table for meals and lessons. She would need schooling. The practical challenges of raising a child emerged in his mind as problems to be solved, a welcome diversion from the emotional complexities that he was less equipped to handle. Jackson had always found comfort in physical labor, in the tangible improvements that came from working with his hands. That night, after a quiet meal where Rebecca ate more heartily than before, Jackson made her a bed of blankets near the fire. He would construct a proper bed frame tomorrow, but for now this would suffice. He sat in his chair, mending harness leather by candlelight, while Rebecca drifted off to sleep. The simple domestic scene struck him with unexpected poignancy, so ordinary, yet so foreign to the life he'd lived these past 5 years. The following weeks established a tentative routine. Jackson rose before dawn, as always, to tend the livestock. Rebecca would be awake when he returned, sitting quietly by the fire or watching through the window as snow fell. They ate breakfast together, a silent communion that gradually became comfortable rather than strained. Mornings were devoted to improvements on the cabin. Jackson constructed a partition across one corner, creating a small bedroom for Rebecca. He built a simple bed frame, stuffed a mattress with clean straw, and installed a curtain that could be drawn for privacy. From wood salvaged from her parents' wagon, He crafted a small chest for her belongings, carefully preserving the original carvings that marked it as Ellis family property. Mrs. Jenkins and her daughter Sarah visited on the third day, bringing more clothes, books, and a slate board for lessons. Sarah, a lively girl with auburn braids and an infectious laugh, approached Rebecca with the straightforward friendliness of childhood. "Do you want to see my doll collection?" she asked, producing miniature cloth figures from her pocket. "Ma says you'll come visit us in town sometimes. We can play jacks when the weather's nice." Rebecca responded with cautious interest, accepting a doll Sarah insisted she keep. The interaction, though brief, seemed to ease some tension in the younger girl. Seeing another child, safe and happy, offered tangible proof that the world was not entirely threatening. After the Jenkins departed, Jackson began teaching Rebecca the routines of ranch life. He showed her how to feed the chickens, collect eggs without disturbing the hens, and distribute hay to the cattle in the winter pen. These simple chores gave structure to her days and began to integrate her into the rhythm of the homestead. "Chickens need gentle hands," he explained, demonstrating how to reach beneath a setting hen to retrieve eggs. "Move slow and sure and they won't mind you." Rebecca absorbed these lessons with solemn attention, her natural intelligence evident in how quickly she mastered each task. By the end of the first week, she was completing her morning chores independently, a development that filled Jackson with quiet pride. The most significant breakthrough came when Jackson introduced Rebecca to Thunder. The big bay gelding had proven his worth during their desperate ride through the blizzard, and Jackson believed in the healing power of the bond between humans and horses. He brought Rebecca to the barn one clear morning, leading Thunder into the paddock where snow had been cleared to create a training area. "Horses can sense fear," he told her, demonstrating how to approach with confidence. "They're prey animals, always watching for danger. If you're scared, they get scared too." Rebecca watched as Jackson moved around the horse, his body language calm and authoritative. Thunder responded to subtle cues, turning or stopping with barely perceptible signals. The partnership between man and animal spoke of years of mutual trust and understanding. "Want to try?" Jackson asked, holding out the lead rope. Rebecca hesitated, then stepped forward, taking the rope with determination in her small face. Thunder lowered his massive head, sniffing her curiously. For a moment, Jackson feared the horse's size might overwhelm her, but Rebecca stood her ground. She reached up a tentative hand, which Thunder nuzzled gently. A smile bloomed across her face, the first Jackson had seen, transforming her solemn features into those of a normal 7-year-old girl. The sight struck Jackson with unexpected force. This, he realized, was why he had made his impulsive vow in the snowdrift, not from duty or loneliness, but for moments like this. The simple joy of a child rediscovering that the world could contain goodness. "He likes you," Jackson said, his own lips curving in a smile that felt foreign after years of disuse. "Can I learn to ride him?" Rebecca asked, her voice stronger than he'd yet heard it. "Start with something smaller," Jackson replied, indicating a gentle dun mare in the adjacent stall. "Daisy there is better for learning. We'll work up to Thunder." Over the next 2 weeks, Jackson taught Rebecca the basics of horsemanship. They began with simple grooming and care, Rebecca standing on a crate to brush Daisy's back. Then came lessons in leading, turning, and basic commands. Finally, Jackson lifted her onto the mare's bare back, teaching her to balance using only her legs while he led them around the paddock. "Feel her movements," and he instructed. "Don't fight against her. Move with her, like you're part of the same creature." Rebecca proved to be a natural rider, her small body intuitively finding the rhythm of the horse's gait. By the end of the second week, she was riding Daisy unassisted in the paddock, her face alight with accomplishment. "My pa taught me to ride," she said one evening, as Jackson prepared dinner. The statement, offered without prompting, was the first reference she had made to her life before the wagon accident. Jackson continued slicing potatoes, keeping his reaction measured to encourage further confidence. "He taught you well." "He made the horse for me," she continued, touching the wooden figure Mrs. Jenkins had retrieved from the general store's lost and found bin. Not the original left on her mother's grave, but similar enough to provide comfort. Said real horses start as wood before they learn to run. These small confidences increased as February gave way to March. The bitter cold eased slightly, though snow still blanketed the land. Rebecca began to speak more frequently, sharing fragments of her previous life. Jackson learned that she had lived in St. Louis, that her father had been a carpenter who specialized in fine furniture, that her mother had taught her letters and numbers at their kitchen table. She also spoke of Uncle Frank, though these references were always accompanied by a shadow crossing her face. He came to our house with loud men. They pushed Pa down the stairs. Ma said we had to leave that night. Jackson filed away these details, constructing a clearer picture of Franklin Reed and the threat he represented. The land deed he had found in David Ellis's pocket remained secured in Jackson's strongbox, along with Elizabeth's diary. These items might prove crucial in establishing Rebecca's legal status and protecting her from her uncle's claims. 3 weeks after bringing Rebecca home, Jackson received word that Sheriff Cooper needed to see him in town. Mrs. Jenkins's son delivered the message during a supply run, adding that it seemed mighty important, according to his mother. Jackson loaded Rebecca onto Daisy the following morning, and they rode to Fort Thompson together. The girl had gained weight during her time at the ranch, her cheeks filling out and her complexion regaining healthy color. The new dress Mrs. Jenkins had sent fit her properly, and her dark hair, now regularly brushed, hung in neat braids tied with ribbon. Fort Thompson had changed subtly in the 3 weeks since their last visit. The snow on the main street had been packed down by traffic, creating a hard-packed surface easier for wagons to navigate. New goods had arrived on the weekly train, and the general store displayed bright calicos and spring tools in its windows. Signs of the coming season change were evident in the activity level of the town, people preparing for the thaw that would bring muddy roads, but also renewed commerce and growth. Jackson tied the horses at the hitching post outside the sheriff's office, lifting Rebecca down and straightening her coat. "Remember what I told you," he said quietly. "Answer the sheriff's questions truthful and clear. He's here to help us." Rebecca nodded solemnly, squaring her small shoulders as if preparing for battle. Inside, Sheriff Cooper sat behind a desk cluttered with wanted posters, legal documents, and a half-eaten lunch. He rose when they entered, offering Rebecca a gentle smile that transformed his usually stern countenance. "Miss Ellis," he said with formal courtesy, "you're looking well. Seems ranch life agrees with you." Rebecca pressed closer to Jackson's side but managed a polite nod. "Got word from St. Louis," Cooper said, shifting his attention to Jackson. His expression grew serious as he lifted a telegraph form from his desk. "Franklin Reed is indeed Elizabeth Ellis's brother. He's filed a formal claim as Rebecca's next of kin and legal guardian." Jackson felt Rebecca's hand tighten in his. "More to the point," Cooper continued, "he's already on his way. Telegram says he left St. Louis by train 2 weeks ago. Should arrive on tomorrow's eastbound." The news settled like lead in Jackson's stomach. He had known this confrontation was inevitable, but the reality of it struck harder than anticipated. 1 month had not been enough time to secure Rebecca's position legally or to prepare her for the trauma of facing her uncle again. "What else do you know about him?" Jackson asked, keeping his voice steady for Rebecca's benefit. Cooper consulted another paper. "Franklin Reed, age 42, vice president at Mercantile Bank of St. Louis. Widower, no children, prominent businessman with connections to the railway companies. No criminal record." He paused, then added reluctantly, "By all official accounts, a respectable citizen." "The diary tells a different story," Jackson countered. "Diary's the word of a dead woman against a living man with money and influence," Cooper replied pragmatically. "Won't hold much legal weight without corroboration." He glanced at Rebecca, then back to Jackson. "Judge Williams arrives same day as Reed. Hearing will be set immediately." As they left the sheriff's office, Rebecca's composure crumbled. Tears filled her eyes, though she fought them with visible effort. "He'll take me away," she whispered. Jackson knelt before her, heedless of the muddy street and curious onlookers. "Listen to me, Rebecca. No one is taking you anywhere you don't want to go. I made you a promise in that snowdrift, and I mean to keep it." "But the sheriff said—" "Sheriff says what the law says, but there's right and there's wrong, and sometimes they're not the same thing. Your uncle may have papers and money, but we have the truth. That counts for something in Montana." They visited the general store before heading home, where Mrs. Jenkins and Sarah greeted Rebecca warmly. While the girls examined a shipment of new hair ribbons, Mrs. Jenkins drew Jackson aside. "I heard Reed arrives tomorrow," she said without preamble. "Martha Cooper may be discreet, But that telegraph operator has a loose tongue after 2 whiskeys. Jackson nodded, unsurprised that the news had already spread. Judge Williams, too, apparently. Hearing to follow. You need Matthew Harrison, Mrs. Jenkins said decisively. Only real lawyer in Fort Thompson. Handles most land disputes and contractual matters for the railway. Smart as they come and owes me a favor after I extended credit during that mining investment disaster last year. Matthew Harrison's law office occupied a narrow building between the bank and the land office, its facade distinguished by freshly painted blue shutters. Inside, the space was dominated by bookshelves filled with leather-bound legal volumes and a massive oak desk positioned to catch the northern light from the front window. Harrison himself proved to be younger than Jackson expected, perhaps 35, with shrewd eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles and a meticulously trimmed mustache. He listened to Jackson's account of finding Rebecca and the subsequent developments without interruption, taking occasional notes on a legal pad. "I'll be direct, Mr. Morgan," he said when Jackson finished. "The law typically favors blood relations in custody matters, especially when the alternative is an unrelated single man, however well-intentioned." "Her uncle threatened her parents," Jackson responded. "The diary makes that clear." "Hearsay evidence," Harrison countered. "Admissible, but not conclusive. We need more." He tapped his pen against his desk thoughtfully. "The bruises Dr. Wilson noted, could they be attributed to Reed? Rebecca hasn't spoken directly about him hurting her, just that he pushed her father downstairs and that she's afraid of him." Harrison nodded. "Children's testimony is complicated. Judges are increasingly willing to consider it, but it's easily undermined by a skilled opponent." He glanced at Rebecca, who sat quietly in a chair by the window, her attention focused on the street outside. "The land deed you mentioned, Ed, may I see it?" Jackson produced the document from his coat pocket. Harrison examined it carefully, his eyebrows rising as he noted certain details. "This is interesting," he murmured. "The land in question adjoins a planned railway extension. Value would increase tenfold once the line is completed." He looked up at Jackson. If Reed is a banking executive with railway connections, he'd know this. $3,000 is already substantial, but the potential value is much greater. "Enough to kill for?" Jackson asked bluntly. Harrison's expression was grim. "Wouldn't be the first time in Western development." He returned the deed. "Keep this secure. It's crucial evidence of motive." As they prepared to leave, Harrison offered one final piece of advice. "Reed will arrive with legal documentation supporting his claim. He'll present himself as a grieving brother seeking to care for his orphaned niece. Your task is to reveal the man behind that facade. If he's truly dangerous, give him opportunity to demonstrate it, ideally before witnesses." The ride back to the ranch was subdued. Rebecca's earlier animation had vanished, replaced by the withdrawn silence of their first days together. Jackson respected her quiet, understanding that she was processing the imminent confrontation with her uncle in her own way. At the cabin, he set about evening chores while Rebecca sat on the porch steps, watching the sun begin its descent toward the western mountains. When Jackson emerged from the barn, he found her in the same position, her small face solemn as she contemplated the approaching challenge. He sat beside her on the step, the weathered wood creaking beneath his weight. For several minutes they sat in companionable silence, watching as the late afternoon light turned the snow-covered landscape to gold. "What if I have to go with him?" Rebecca finally asked, her voice barely audible. Jackson considered his response carefully. He would not lie to her, not even to offer false comfort. "If that happens," he said slowly, "you remember what I taught you. Watch everything. Listen more than you speak. Find allies where you can." He paused. "And know that I will never stop trying to bring you home." Rebecca nodded, absorbing this. "Pa said sometimes you have to bend to keep from breaking. Like saplings in a storm." "Your pa was a wise man." "He stood up to Uncle Frank, though." Her voice wavered slightly. "He didn't bend then." "Sometimes you can't," Jackson agreed. "Sometimes a thing is so wrong that you have to stand, whatever comes after." They watched as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Jackson found himself searching for words of comfort that wouldn't ring hollow. Before he could speak, Rebecca leaned against his side, a gesture of trust that needed no verbal accompaniment. That night, as Rebecca slept in her curtained alcove, Jackson sat at his table cleaning his revolver by lamplight. The Colt Army Model 1860, carried throughout his cavalry service and the years that followed, was as much a part of him as his own right arm. He worked methodically, the familiar routine allowing his mind to plan for the confrontation ahead. He hoped the matter could be resolved peacefully through legal channels. Judge Williams had a reputation for fairness, and Harrison seemed competent enough. But Jackson had lived too long in a hard land to rely solely on civilization's structures. If Reed truly posed a danger to Rebecca, Jackson would not hesitate to act outside those structures. As he reassembled the revolver, his thoughts drifted to Sarah and Thomas. He had failed to protect them, a fact that still haunted his dreams. The illness that took them had struck with such speed, such merciless efficiency, that no amount of preparation or vigilance could have altered the outcome. But this threat to Rebecca was different, a human adversary that could be anticipated, confronted, defeated. "I won't fail again," he whispered to the silent cabin. Dawn broke clear and cold on the day Franklin Reed was due to arrive. Jackson rose earlier than usual, spending extra time with his morning chores to ensure the ranch would run smoothly during their absence. Rebecca joined him in the barn, completing her tasks with quiet efficiency. Neither mentioned the approaching confrontation, but it hung between them, charging the morning routine with unspoken tension. They departed for Fort Thompson by mid-morning. Jackson had decided they would face Reed directly rather than waiting to be summoned. Better to choose the battlefield than have it imposed upon them. Rebecca rode Daisy confidently now, managing the mare with growing skill despite the gravity of their mission. The train from the east was scheduled to arrive at noon. By 11:30, Jackson and Rebecca had positioned themselves on the station platform, a strategic location that would allow them to observe Reed before he became aware of their presence. Matthew Harrison joined them, his formal suit and briefcase lending an air of official legitimacy to their welcoming committee. "Remember," Harrison murmured to Jackson, "let him make the first aggressive move. Your position is stronger if he demonstrates hostility unprovoked." Jackson nodded, though his instincts urged a more direct approach. Beside him, Rebecca stood straight-backed and solemn, her small hand firmly in his. Whatever came, they would face it together. In the distance, a plume of smoke appeared above the eastern plains, heralding the approach of the locomotive that carried Franklin Reed toward his reckoning with the man who had claimed his niece, and perhaps much more than he had bargained for. The locomotive's approach thundered through the crisp Montana air, a mechanical harbinger of change bearing down upon Fort Thompson's modest station. Black smoke billowed skyward, the iron wheels ground against the tracks, the eastbound train gradually surrendering its momentum. Steam hissed from the engine as it came to rest beside the platform, a momentary shroud that parted to reveal passenger cars lined with frost-covered windows. Jackson stood immobile, his weathered face betraying no emotion as he scanned each figure that emerged from the train. Rebecca pressed against his side, her small body tense with anticipation. Harrison adjusted his spectacles, briefcase clutched in his left hand, ready for the legal battle ahead. They didn't have to wait long to identify Franklin Reed. He descended from the first-class car with the confident bearing of a man accustomed to deference. Tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in a tailored black overcoat with a silk cravat visible at his throat, Reed cut an imposing figure against Fort Thompson's rustic backdrop. His features shared certain similarities with Rebecca's, the same high cheekbones and straight nose, though his face was hardened by ambition and calculation, where hers showed only innocence and apprehension. Reed was accompanied by another man, shorter and wiry, carrying a leather portfolio, and surveying the platform with the nervous vigilance of a loyal subordinate. A lawyer, Jackson surmised, brought from St. Louis to intimidate local opposition. Rebecca's grip on Jackson's hand tightened painfully. "Uncle Frank," she whispered, fear vibrating through the simple words. Reed's gaze swept the platform, passing over them initially, then returning with sudden recognition. His expression shifted from casual arrogance to calculated charm as he approached, his companion hurrying to keep pace. "Rebecca!" Reed called, his voice carrying the polished intonation of Eastern education. "My dear niece, thank God you're safe." Jackson felt Rebecca edge behind him, using his body as a shield. The movement was not lost on Reed, whose smile faltered momentarily before reasserting itself with greater determination. "You must be the man who found my niece," Reed addressed Jackson directly. "I'm deeply grateful for your intervention, sir." Morgan, Jackson replied flatly. Jackson Morgan. Franklin Reed. He extended a gloved hand which Jackson deliberately ignored. Reed withdrew it smoothly as if the rejection were of no consequence. This is Edmund Walsh, my attorney. We've come to bring Rebecca home to St. Louis, where she belongs. Harrison stepped forward, offering his own hand with professional courtesy. Matthew Harrison, counsel for Mr. Morgan and Rebecca Ellis. I'm afraid the matter of the child's placement isn't quite so straightforward, Mr. Reed. There are serious concerns regarding your suitability as guardian. Walsh's eyebrows rose. Concerns? Mr. Reed is the girl's only living blood relative and a respected businessman in St. Louis. The law is quite clear on such matters. The law is concerned with the child's welfare above all, Harrison countered. We have evidence suggesting Mr. Reed poses a danger to his niece. Reed's face darkened momentarily before he mastered himself. Preposterous. What evidence could possibly— He stopped, eyes narrowing as understanding dawned. Ah, my sister's diary, I presume. Poor Elizabeth was not well toward the end. Paranoid delusions, the doctor said. A family tragedy. The calculated dismissal of Elizabeth's accusations revealed much about Reed's character. Jackson noted how easily the man lied, how readily he maligned his dead sister to serve his purposes. Rebecca trembled beside him, her fear now mingled with indignation at the slander against her mother. Judge Williams arrived on the same train, Harrison said. He'll hear evidence from both sides tomorrow morning at 9. Until then, Rebecca remains in Mr. Morgan's custody by order of Sheriff Cooper. Reed's smile remained fixed, but his eyes hardened. Of course, due process must be observed, even in these frontier circumstances. His gaze shifted to Rebecca, who still half hid behind Jackson. I'll see you tomorrow, dear niece. We have so much to discuss about your future. The threat underlying his cordial tone was unmistakable. Jackson stepped forward, intentionally placing himself more fully between Reed and Rebecca. We're done here, he said quietly, a dangerous edge to his voice that made Walsh take an involuntary step backward. Reed, however, stood his ground. For now, Mr. Morgan, we're done for now. As Reed and Walsh departed toward the Fort Thompson Hotel, Harrison exhaled slowly. He's smoother than I anticipated. Judges respond well to men like him. Polished, articulate, apparently reasonable. He's a snake, Jackson replied, just wearing expensive boots. They retired to Harrison's office to prepare for the next day's hearing. The lawyer's quarters above his practice provided a comfortable, if sparse, meeting place, far from the curious eyes and ears of the town's saloon and hotel where Reed had established himself. Rebecca sat quietly in a corner chair, a book from Harrison's shelf open but unread in her lap, while the men discussed strategy. The diary is our strongest evidence, Harrison noted, leafing through Elizabeth Ellis's journal. Multiple entries documenting threats, specific incidents of intimidation. But as predicted, Reed has already attempted to undermine its reliability by suggesting your mother was unstable, Rebecca. The girl looked up sharply. Ma wasn't crazy. She was scared. There's a difference. Harrison nodded appreciatively at her insight. Precisely, and that's what we need to establish. That her fear was rational based on real danger posed by your uncle. The land deed, Jackson suggested. It shows motive. That Colorado property is worth a fortune, especially with the railway coming through. Yes, but that alone doesn't prove Reed would harm the child. Greed isn't sufficient to deny custody to a blood relative. Harrison removed his spectacles, pinching the bridge of his nose. We need more. Rebecca, did your uncle ever hurt you directly? Not just threats or frightening behavior, but actual physical harm? Rebecca hesitated, her eyes downcast. He grabbed my arm once, squeezed until it bruised. Said I should tell Pa to give him the papers or accidents happen to little girls. Her voice had diminished to a whisper by the end. Jackson's hand tightened on the arm of his chair, knuckles whitening. The casual cruelty of threatening a child stirred a cold fury in him that he carefully contained. Rebecca needed his strength now, not his rage. That's valuable testimony, Harrison said gently. Would you be willing to tell Judge Williams about that incident? Rebecca nodded, though fear shadowed her features. Will Uncle Frank be there when I talk? Yes, but he won't be able to reach you. The judge, Sheriff Cooper, and Mr. Morgan will all be present to ensure your safety. They spent another hour reviewing questions the judge might ask and preparing responses. Harrison was thorough, considering every angle Reed's lawyer might exploit. As they prepared to leave, the attorney took Jackson aside while Rebecca gathered her coat. "There's something else you should know," Harrison murmured. "I made inquiries about Reed through colleagues in St. Louis. There are rumors, nothing provable, linking him to financial irregularities at his bank. Substantial sums missing from certain accounts, particularly those belonging to widows and elderly clients, unlikely to scrutinize their statements closely." "You think he's embezzling?" "I think a man willing to threaten a child might be capable of other transgressions. And a man stealing from his bank might be desperately in need of a valuable land deed to cover his tracks before auditors discover the discrepancies." This new information added urgency to their situation. If Reed faced financial ruin and possibly criminal charges in St. Louis, his desperation would make him more dangerous, not less. The short ride back to the ranch passed in contemplative silence. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the snow-covered landscape, the beauty of Montana's wilderness, a stark contrast to the human darkness they now confronted. As they approached the cabin, Jackson noted fresh tracks in the snow, leading to and from his door. Someone had visited during their absence. "Stay on your horse," he instructed Rebecca, drawing his revolver. With practiced caution, he approached the cabin, alert for any sign of danger. The door stood slightly ajar, though he distinctly remembered latching it before their departure. He pushed it open with the barrel of his Colt, scanning the interior before entering. Nothing appeared disturbed at first glance. The fire had died to embers. The furniture remained in its usual positions, and Rebecca's curtained sleeping area was undisturbed. Only when Jackson checked his personal lockbox, concealed beneath a floorboard near his bed, did he discover the intrusion's purpose. The box had been forced open, its contents, including Elizabeth's diary and the land deed, scattered across the floor. Except the diary and deed were still in Harrison's possession, safely stored in his office safe. "Clever," Jackson murmured, understanding the game now. Reed had sent someone to search for the documents, not knowing they were elsewhere. The intruder had found Jackson's lockbox, but not the items he sought, leaving Reed uncertain whether Jackson had the papers with him or hidden elsewhere. Jackson secured the cabin before bringing Rebecca inside. He didn't mention the break-in immediately, not wanting to add to her anxiety before the hearing. Instead, he focused on practical matters: preparing dinner, discussing the next day's schedule, maintaining the routine they had established over the past weeks. Only after Rebecca had retired to her alcove, the curtain drawn across the entrance, did Jackson take inventory of what was missing. His spare ammunition, $40 from his emergency fund, and a silver pocket watch that had belonged to his father. Items taken to make the theft appear motivated by common robbery rather than a targeted search. Sheriff Cooper would need to be informed, but Jackson decided it could wait until morning. The break-in changed nothing about their legal strategy and served mainly to confirm Reed's desperation and dishonesty. If anything, it strengthened their position by demonstrating the man's willingness to resort to criminal methods. Dawn arrived with a crystalline clarity that belied the tension simmering in Fort Thompson. Jackson and Rebecca prepared for the day with the solemn focus of soldiers before battle. He helped her dress in her finest clothes, a blue wool dress Mrs. Jenkins had altered specifically for the hearing, polished boots, and hair neatly braided with ribbon. For his own appearance, Jackson abandoned his usual flannel and denims in favor of a seldom-worn suit, preserved from his wedding day and now slightly tight across the shoulders. "You look different," Rebecca observed as he struggled with his tie. "Feel different too," Jackson admitted, "like these clothes belong to another man." "They do," she said with unexpected wisdom. "The man before the snow, before me." Jackson paused, struck by the truth in her assessment. He was not the same person who had folded this suit into his trunk 5 years ago, grief-stricken and retreating from life. The past weeks had changed him, awakened parts of himself he had thought permanently frozen. "Reckon you're right about that," he said, abandoning the tie altogether and opening his collar instead. Some pretenses weren't worth the effort. Judge Williams would have to accept him as he was, a rancher, not a city gentleman. They arrived at the town hall 30 minutes before the scheduled hearing. The building, which served as church, meeting space, and occasional courtroom, had been arranged for the proceedings. A large table at the front served as the judge's bench, with smaller tables for the opposing parties positioned to either side. Rows of chairs accommodated spectators, many already filled with townspeople, eager to witness the drama. Harrison met them at the entrance, his expression grave. Reed arrived 10 minutes ago with Walsh and two other men, witnesses presumably, to testify to his character. He appears supremely confident. Men like him always do, Jackson replied, right up until they're not. They took their places at the left-hand table. Rebecca sat between Jackson and Harrison, her back straight despite her evident nervousness. From the opposite table, Reed watched them with calculated intensity, occasionally leaning to whisper to Walsh or one of his companions. At precisely 9 o'clock, Sheriff Cooper entered from a side door. "All rise," he announced. "The Territorial Court of Montana is now in session, the Honorable Judge Emmett Williams presiding." Judge Williams proved to be a man in his 60s, with a shock of white hair and penetrating gray eyes that seemed to evaluate everything they observed. He wore the traditional black robe of his office, lending gravity to proceedings that might otherwise have seemed informal in the modest surroundings. "Be seated," he instructed, arranging papers before him. "This hearing concerns the guardianship of Rebecca Ellis, minor child, age 7 years. I understand there are competing claims." His gaze shifted between the tables. "Mr. Walsh, as you represent the petitioning party, you may present your case first." Walsh rose, straightening his vest. "Thank you, Your Honor. We are here today on a simple matter of family reunification. Mr. Franklin Reed, the child's maternal uncle and only surviving blood relative, seeks custody of his niece following the tragic deaths of her parents. Mr. Reed is a respected banking executive in St. Louis, financially secure and able to provide Rebecca with every advantage: proper schooling, cultural opportunities, the stability of established society." He proceeded to outline Reed's credentials: his position as vice president at Mercantile Bank, his home on a prestigious street in St. Louis, his connections with leading families. Two character witnesses testified to Reed's standing in the community, describing him as generous, civic-minded, and deeply concerned with family legacy. Throughout this testimony, Reed maintained an expression of dignified grief, occasionally glancing toward Rebecca with what appeared to be avuncular concern. It was a masterful performance, Jackson had to admit, one calculated to impress a judge accustomed to weighing character and capability. When Walsh concluded, Judge Williams turned to Harrison. "Counselor, you may present your response." Harrison rose with deliberate calm. "Your Honor, this case is not, as my colleague suggests, a simple matter of family reunification. It is instead a question of a child's safety and well-being. We contend that Franklin Reed, despite his apparent respectability, poses a serious danger to Rebecca Ellis." He introduced Jackson, describing the circumstances under which he had discovered Rebecca and the care he had provided since. Dr. Wilson testified to Rebecca's physical condition when first examined, noting both the injuries consistent with the wagon accident and the older bruises suggesting prior mistreatment. "Furthermore," Harrison continued, "we have documentary evidence that Mr. Reed threatened Rebecca's parents repeatedly over a land deed Mr. Ellis had lawfully inherited. These threats eventually forced the family to flee St. Louis in fear for their lives." He presented Elizabeth's diary, reading several entries that explicitly described Reed's intimidation tactics. Reed's expression remained impassive, though a muscle twitched in his jaw as his sister's accusations were read aloud. "This diary," Walsh objected, rising to his feet, "is hearsay evidence from a woman who, regrettably, suffered from nervous disorders that affected her perception of reality. We have physicians' documentation of Mrs. Ellis's treatments for anxiety and delusions." Harrison countered smoothly. "We also have the land deed itself, showing property valued at $3,000, potentially much more with the planned railway extension. This provides clear motive for Mr. Reed's pursuit of his niece. Control of the child means control of the property until she reaches majority." The legal battle continued through the morning, each side presenting evidence and counter-arguments with increasing intensity. Judge Williams listened attentively, occasionally interrupting with precise questions that suggested he was weighing each claim carefully. As noon approached, Harrison called his final witness. "Your Honor, we would like Rebecca Ellis to testify regarding her experiences with her uncle." Walsh immediately objected. "Your Honor, the child is too young to provide reliable testimony, especially given the trauma of losing her parents and the undue influence exerted by Mr. Morgan during these past weeks. Judge Williams considered this, then addressed Rebecca directly. "Young lady, do you understand the difference between truth and falsehood?" Rebecca nodded solemnly. "Yes, sir. Telling the truth is saying what really happened, even if it's hard. Lying is saying what didn't happen to get out of trouble or hurt someone." The judge's expression softened slightly. "Well said. Do you feel able to tell this court the truth about your uncle and what happened before you came to Montana?" "Yes, sir," Rebecca replied, her voice small but steady. "Then I'll hear her testimony," Williams decided. "Sheriff Cooper, please arrange the seating so Miss Ellis can speak without directly facing her uncle." Cooper repositioned Rebecca's chair to face the judge, with her back partially to Reed's table. Jackson remained close enough to offer support, but positioned so as not to appear to influence her responses. "Now, Rebecca," the judge began gently, "can you tell me about your life in St. Louis with your parents?" Rebecca spoke haltingly at first, describing a happy home where her father crafted furniture and her mother taught her lessons. Her voice grew tenser as she recounted her uncle's increasingly frequent visits, the arguments that ensued, and the atmosphere of fear that developed. "Uncle Frank wanted Pa's papers," she explained. "Said the land should have been his because he was older than Ma and a man besides. Pa said Grandpa gave it special to him because Uncle Frank already had the bank position." "Did your uncle ever threaten you or your parents?" Judge Williams asked. Rebecca nodded, her hands twisting in her lap. "He told Pa that accidents happen to people who don't cooperate. Then he looked at me and said, especially to little girls who wander too close to the river." Her voice dropped almost to a whisper. "He grabbed my arm once, squeezed it real hard. Left marks. Said next time it wouldn't just be marks if Pa didn't sign the papers." From the corner of his eye, Jackson saw Reed shift in his seat, his confident facade cracking slightly. Walsh placed a restraining hand on his client's arm, a gesture that did not escape the judge's notice. "What happened that made your family leave St. Louis?" Williams continued. "Uncle Frank came with two men. They pushed into our house. Pa tried to stop them, and they pushed him down the stairs. He hurt his leg bad. Uncle Frank said next time it would be his neck. Ma packed our bags that night, said we had to go where Uncle Frank couldn't find us." The simplicity of Rebecca's account carried a weight that more polished testimony lacked. Even Walsh seemed momentarily at a loss for how to undermine it. Judge Williams thanked Rebecca for her courage and called a recess for the midday meal. As the courtroom emptied, Harrison expressed cautious optimism. The judge was clearly moved by Rebecca's testimony. Reed's reaction didn't help his case either. That momentary flash of anger suggests the potential for violence that Rebecca described. They took their meal at Mrs. Jenkins' home, away from the curious stares at the hotel dining room where Reed held court with local businessmen he hoped to impress. Sarah kept Rebecca occupied with a game of jacks, providing welcome distraction from the morning's ordeal. "How do you think it's going?" Mrs. Jenkins asked quietly as she served coffee. "Hard to say," Jackson admitted. "Reed presents well. All that money and Eastern polish counts for something, even here." "Not as much as he thinks," she replied firmly. "Judge Williams grew up poor in Pennsylvania, worked mines before studying law. He's not easily impressed by fancy clothes and banking connections." This insight provided some comfort as they prepared to return for the afternoon session. As they walked toward the town hall, however, a commotion near the sheriff's office caught their attention. A crowd had gathered around a man seated on the office steps, his face bloodied and clothes torn. "That's Jim Peters," Mrs. Jenkins identified him. "Works freight for the railway station." Jackson approached, recognition dawning as he drew closer. Peters was the man who had delivered supplies to his ranch on several occasions, a reliable worker well known in Fort Thompson. Currently, he appeared to have been on the losing end of a severe beating. Sheriff Cooper stood over him, notebook in hand. "Say again who did this to you, Jim." Peters spat blood onto the snow. "Two men, strangers. Said they worked for someone who needed information about Morgan's place. When I wouldn't talk, they got persuasive with their fists." Cooper noticed Jackson's approach and gestured him over. "Morgan, this concerns you. Peters here was attacked for refusing to give information about your ranch." They wanted to know if there was a safe or strong box, Peters continued, wincing as he touched his split lip. Whether you might have papers hidden somewhere. I told them nothing, but they seemed mighty interested in finding something specific. Jackson exchanged glances with Harrison. Reed was growing desperate, resorting to increasingly direct methods to locate the land deed before the judge rendered his decision. This needs to be entered into evidence, Harrison said urgently. It demonstrates exactly the kind of intimidation and violence Rebecca testified about. When court reconvened, Harrison immediately brought the incident to Judge Williams's attention. Reed appeared genuinely surprised, either at the attack itself or at it being discovered so quickly. Your Honor, Walsh protested, there is absolutely no evidence connecting Mr. Reed to this regrettable incident. It's a transparent attempt to prejudice the court against my client. Perhaps, Williams acknowledged, but it is troubling nonetheless. Mr. Reed, do you have any knowledge of this attack on Mr. Peters? Reed stood, the picture of offended dignity. None whatsoever, Your Honor. I have been in the company of witnesses all morning, as the court can verify. Whatever transpired with this freight worker is entirely unrelated to these proceedings. The denial was smooth, practiced, and technically accurate. Reed himself had indeed been in the courtroom all morning, but the judge's expression suggested he found the coincidence suspicious at minimum. The afternoon proceedings grew increasingly contentious as Walsh fought to redirect attention to Reed's qualifications as guardian and Harrison persistently returned to the pattern of threats and intimidation. By 4 o'clock, both sides had presented their full cases, and Judge Williams called for closing statements. Walsh emphasized tradition, blood ties, and the superior resources Reed could provide. Harrison countered with impassioned arguments about safety, stability, and the deep bond that had formed between Rebecca and Jackson. Your Honor, Harrison concluded, the law rightly recognizes the importance of family connections, but it also acknowledges that the child's welfare must be paramount. Rebecca Ellis has found safety, healing, and genuine care with Jackson Morgan. To place her with a man who has demonstrated both the intent and capacity for violence, regardless of his financial means or blood relationship, would violate the very principle of protection that guardianship laws are designed to uphold. Judge Williams thanked both attorneys and announced he would deliver his ruling after careful consideration of all evidence. Given the circumstances in the late hour, I will render my decision tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. Until then, Rebecca remains in Mr. Morgan's temporary custody. As the court adjourned, Reed approached Jackson directly for the first time since their initial meeting at the train station. His public mask of respectability had thinned, revealing hints of the calculating ruthlessness beneath. A temporary arrangement at best, Morgan, he said, voice pitched low for privacy. Even if this backwater judge rules in your favor, there are higher courts. I will pursue this matter to its conclusion. So will I, Jackson replied evenly. Difference is I'm protecting the child. You're just after Ellis's land. Reed's eyes narrowed. You know nothing about my motivations or my relationship with my sister's family. This sanctimonious frontier justice may impress the locals, but it won't stand against proper legal procedure in St. Louis. You're not in St. Louis, Jackson reminded him. Out here, a man's word and actions count more than his bank account. Something dangerous flickered in Reed's expression, a glimpse of the man Rebecca truly feared. Enjoy your moral superiority while it lasts, rancher. By this time tomorrow, Rebecca will be on a train east with me, and you'll be alone again in that pathetic cabin. He turned sharply and strode away, Walsh hurrying to catch up, their figures soon disappearing into the hotel. Harrison approached, having witnessed the exchange from a discreet distance. What did Reed want? He asked. To make threats, Jackson answered. He's worried, starting to show his true nature. Let's hope Judge Williams saw enough of that nature in court today. Harrison checked his pocket watch. You should get Rebecca back to the ranch. Tomorrow will be decisive one way or another. The ride home passed in contemplative silence. Rebecca, exhausted by the day's emotions and tensions, leaned against Jackson's chest as they rode double on Thunder. The familiar landscape of the ranch appeared as dusk gathered, the cabin windows dark and uninviting after the earlier intrusion. Jackson took extra precautions that night, checking and rechecking the cabin security. He placed a chair beneath the door handle and kept his revolver within reach. Rebecca fell asleep quickly, the emotional toll of her testimony having drained her completely. Jackson himself remained vigilant, dozing in his chair rather than properly sleeping, alert to any sound that might signal danger. His caution proved warranted shortly after midnight when Thunder's warning whinny from the barn cut through the night's stillness. Jackson was instantly alert, moving silently to the window. In the moonlight, he could discern two figures approaching the cabin from the direction of the road, their movements suggesting they hoped to remain undetected. Reed's men, almost certainly, sent to make a final attempt at finding the land deed, or perhaps with more sinister intentions. Jackson calculated his options quickly. He could remain barricaded in the cabin, but that would place Rebecca at risk if the intruders were determined enough to force entry. Better to confront them be outside, away from the child. "Rebecca," he whispered, gently waking her, "I need you to hide under the bed and stay absolutely silent, no matter what you hear. Can you do that?" She nodded, instantly understanding the seriousness of the situation. "Is it Uncle Frank?" "Probably his men. I'm going to make sure they leave, but I need to know you're safe while I do that." Rebecca slipped from her bed and underneath it without further questions, pressing herself against the wall where shadows would conceal her completely. Jackson checked his revolver one final time, then slipped out through the cabin's rear window, an exit the intruders were unlikely to be monitoring. The bitter cold of the Montana night bit through his clothing as he circled wide around the cabin, positioning himself to approach the men from behind. They had reached the porch now, one keeping watch while the other worked on the door lock. The moonlight gleamed on a revolver in the watchman's hand, confirming these were no simple thieves. Jackson closed the distance silently, years of frontier experience guiding his movements. When he was 10 feet away, he deliberately stepped on a branch, the crack causing both men to whirl toward the sound. "Looking for something?" Jackson asked calmly, his own revolver leveled steadily at the pair. The armed man recovered quickly, shifting his weapon toward Jackson. "Just having a friendly conversation with Morgan here. Nothing that concerns you." "I am Morgan," Jackson replied, "and you're trespassing on my land." The men exchanged glances, realizing their mistake. The armed one, a hard-faced individual with a scar running along his jaw, kept his revolver trained on Jackson. "Mr. Reed wants what belongs to him. The land deed and the diary. Hand them over, and we'll be on our way. Nobody needs to get hurt." Reed sent armed men in the middle of the night to threaten a man and a child, and you're claiming nobody needs to get hurt? Jackson's voice remained steady, though cold fury underlay the words. "The papers aren't here. They're with the lawyer in town, already presented as evidence in court. Your employer has made a serious miscalculation." The scarred man's expression darkened. "Then I guess we'll have to take something else back to Mr. Reed. The girl, maybe. She's his bloodkin, after all." Jackson's finger tightened on his trigger. "You're not taking Rebecca anywhere." The standoff stretched for several heartbeats, tension crackling in the freezing air. Then a new voice entered the confrontation. "I'd advise against any hasty actions, gentlemen." Sheriff Cooper emerged from the shadows of the barn, his shotgun trained on the intruders. Behind him stood two deputies, similarly armed. "Drop the gun," Cooper ordered. "Slowly, handle first." The scarred man hesitated, calculating his chances and evidently finding them insufficient. He lowered his weapon carefully to the ground. "Franklin Reed sent you," Cooper stated rather than asked, "to retrieve documents or abduct the child. Either way, that's attempted kidnapping at minimum." The men maintained a stubborn silence as the deputies handcuffed them. Cooper turned to Jackson. "When Harrison told me about Peter's beating, I figured Reed might try something more direct. Thought it prudent to keep an eye on your place tonight." "Appreciate it," Jackson said simply. "These two will be enjoying Fort Thompson's hospitality until the judge's ruling tomorrow, and I suspect their presence in my jail will feature prominently in his honors deliberations." After the sheriff and his prisoners departed, Jackson returned to the cabin, where Rebecca emerged from her hiding place, visibly shaken but composed. "They wanted to take me to Uncle Frank," she said, a statement rather than a question. "They did, but they failed." Jackson knelt to her level. "Sheriff Cooper arrested them. They can't hurt you now." Rebecca considered this, her young face solemn in the lamplight. "Uncle Frank won't stop, will he? Not ever." The question struck at the heart of Jackson's own concerns. Reed had demonstrated a ruthless determination to possess both the land deed and his niece, escalating from legal maneuvers to outright violence when thwarted. Such men rarely abandon their objectives while means to pursue them remained. Some fights don't end clean, Jackson admitted. But after tonight, the judge will see Reed for what he truly is. That gives us an advantage. They remained awake for what little remained of the night, Rebecca unwilling to return to sleep and Jackson unwilling to let down his guard despite the sheriff's intervention. As dawn approached, they prepared for the day's critical hearing, both understanding that their future together hung in the balance of Judge Williams's decision. Fort Thompson buzzed with excitement as they arrived for the 9 o'clock ruling. News of the midnight confrontation and subsequent arrests had spread through town with remarkable speed, generating intense speculation about the judge's likely decision. The town hall was filled beyond capacity, with onlookers standing along the walls and spilling out into the street. Reed sat at his table, outwardly composed but radiating tension. The absence of his hired men and their failure to return with either documents or Rebecca had clearly unsettled him. Walsh conferred with him urgently, their whispered conversation appearing less than harmonious. Judge Williams entered precisely at 9, his expression grave as he took his seat. The room fell silent, the collective anticipation almost palpable. "Before rendering my decision," Williams began, "I must address events that transpired after yesterday's adjournment. Sheriff Cooper has provided sworn testimony regarding the arrest of 2 armed men at Mr. Morgan's ranch last night. These individuals have since confessed to being hired by Franklin Reed to retrieve certain documents by any means necessary, with authorization to abduct Rebecca Ellis if those documents could not be located." Reed rose abruptly. "Your Honor, I categorically deny." "Sit down, Mr. Reed," Williams ordered sharply. "Your opportunity to speak has passed. These men have signed affidavits naming you specifically, corroborated by funds traced to your possession. Furthermore, the physician who treated Mr. Peters has confirmed that his injuries match the description of an attack by these same individuals earlier yesterday." Reed sank back into his chair, his facade of respectability crumbling visibly. Walsh edged away slightly, the attorney's instinct for self-preservation evidently overcoming his professional loyalty. "In light of these developments," Williams continued, "and considering all testimony and evidence presented during yesterday's proceedings, my ruling is as follows." The judge straightened, his voice taking on the formal cadence of legal proclamation. "The court finds that Franklin Reed has demonstrated through both testimony and subsequent actions a pattern of behavior that renders him profoundly unsuitable as guardian to Rebecca Ellis. Custody is therefore denied." A murmur ran through the assembled crowd, Reed's face flushed with anger, his hands gripping the table edge with whitened knuckles. "Furthermore," Williams continued, "given the documented threats against the child and the attempted abduction, the court issues a protective order prohibiting Franklin Reed from approaching or contacting Rebecca Ellis until she reaches the age of majority." The judge turned his attention to Jackson. "Regarding Mr. Morgan's petition for guardianship, the court finds that he has demonstrated exceptional care and commitment to Rebecca's welfare under difficult circumstances. While unrelated by blood, he has acted with the dedication and protection expected of a natural parent." Williams paused, allowing the significance of his words to register. "The court therefore grants permanent legal guardianship of Rebecca Ellis to Jackson Morgan, with all rights and responsibilities thereof, including stewardship of her inherited property, until she reaches legal age." The pronouncement hung in the air for a moment before the room erupted in reaction. Applause from many townspeople who had come to support Jackson, outraged objections from Reed, and the steady rap of the judge's gavel calling for order. "One final matter," Williams announced when the noise subsided. "Sheriff Cooper, please take Mr. Reed into custody pending formal charges of conspiracy to commit kidnapping, witness intimidation, and attempted theft." Reed's face contorted with rage as Cooper approached. "This is outrageous. You backwater incompetents have no jurisdiction over me. I'll have this ruling overturned within the week." "You're welcome to appeal from the territorial prison," Williams replied coolly, "though I suspect your banking colleagues in St. Louis might be more interested in investigating certain financial irregularities that have come to light during these proceedings." As Cooper led a still protesting Reed away, Harrison turned to Jackson and Rebecca with undisguised satisfaction. "Congratulations. It's rare to see justice so thoroughly and decisively served." Rebecca looked up at Jackson, uncertainty in her eyes despite the favorable ruling. Is it really over? Can I stay with you for true? Jackson knelt to meet her gaze directly. For true, he confirmed. You're stuck with me now, officially. The smile that blossomed across her face contained a joy that transcended the legal proceedings, the simple happiness of a child who had found home and safety after unimaginable loss. She threw her arms around Jackson's neck in an uninhibited embrace that caught him momentarily by surprise before he returned it, his own emotions unexpectedly close to the surface. Mrs. Jenkins approached, wiping tears from her eyes without embarrassment. Well then, I believe this calls for celebration. Dinner at my house tonight for the newest official family in Fort Thompson. The following days brought rapid changes to Reed's circumstances. Telegrams from St. Louis confirmed Harrison's suspicions about financial improprieties at Mercantile Bank. Reed's desperate pursuit of the land deed now appeared motivated by need rather than mere greed. He had embezzled substantial sums and required the valuable property to replace the stolen funds before their absence was discovered. Within a week, Reed was transferred to St. Louis under guard to face multiple charges there, in addition to those in Montana Territory. The attempted abduction of Rebecca faded to secondary importance compared to his systematic theft from bank clients, many of whom were prominent citizens with political influence. For Jackson and Rebecca, life settled into new patterns as winter gradually released its grip on the Montana landscape. The legal proceedings had accelerated their integration into the Fort Thompson community. Jackson found himself drawn into town affairs more frequently, his natural reticence balanced by the practical need to establish connections that would benefit his ward. Rebecca began attending the town school, riding Daisy alongside Sarah Jenkins each morning when weather permitted. Her natural intelligence blossomed under formal instruction, though Jackson supplemented her education with practical knowledge during evenings at the ranch. She learned to calculate feed quantities for livestock, to read weather patterns and cloud formations, to identify plants with medicinal properties, skills passed down through generations of frontier experience. Spring brought new activity to the ranch as Jackson implemented long-deferred improvements. With Rebecca's future now secured, he expanded the cabin, adding a proper bedroom for her and enlarging the main living space. The project drew unexpected assistance from townspeople, the blacksmith contributing hinges and fixtures, the sawmill owner offering lumber at reduced cost, even Sheriff Cooper spending a Saturday helping raise roof beams. Never figured you for a builder, Cooper, Jackson commented as they worked. The sheriff shrugged. Built my own house when I first came to Montana. Besides, it's for the girl. Whole town's taken an interest in her welfare. This community involvement represented a profound change in Jackson's circumstances. For 5 years following Sarah and Thomas's deaths, he had existed in isolation, rebuffing attempts at friendship or assistance. Now, through Rebecca, connections had been reestablished, pulling him back into the world of human relationship he had abandoned in grief. On a warm June afternoon, Rebecca sat on the newly constructed porch steps, watching Jackson mend a bridle. She had been uncharacteristically thoughtful all day, her usual chatter subdued by some internal preoccupation. Something troubling you? Jackson asked finally. Rebecca hesitated before responding. I was thinking about Ma and Pa, about their graves. Jackson set aside his work, giving her his full attention. The subject of her parents had arisen infrequently since the court hearing, as if the resolution of the custody matter had allowed Rebecca to process her grief in private. What about them? He prompted gently. They're all alone out there, no markers with their names, just the crosses you made. Nobody to visit them. She looked up at him, her expression troubled. I left Pa's horse on Ma's grave, but now I don't even have that to remember them by. Jackson considered her concerns seriously. The makeshift graves he had created during the blizzard had always been intended as temporary measures, though the immediate challenges of caring for Rebecca and the subsequent legal battle had pushed proper burial arrangements into the background. We could change that, he suggested. Ride out there, place proper stones, make it a real resting place they'd be proud of. Rebecca's face brightened. Could we? And could I make something new to leave there? Something special like Pa used to make for me? I think that's a fine idea. Over the next week, they prepared for the journey. Jackson carved 2 solid headstones from local limestone, carefully etching David and Elizabeth Ellis's names and dates based on information from Rebecca. The girl herself worked on her own project in secret, spending hours at the small workbench Jackson had built for her, refusing to reveal her creation until it was completed. They set out on a clear morning in late June. The prairie transformed from its winter barrenness to a lush expanse of wildflowers and knee-high grasses. Rebecca rode Daisy with newfound confidence, managing the mare independently over the rolling terrain. Jackson had loaded the headstones onto a pack horse, the substantial weight requiring careful balance across the animal's back. Finding the gravesite proved challenging after the landscape's seasonal transformation. What had been distinct landmarks in the snow-covered terrain now blended into the uniform greenery. Jackson relied on his frontiersman's sense of direction and specific features he had noted during their original journey: a lightning-struck pine visible on the distant ridge, the particular curve of a creek bed that had been frozen but now bubbled with spring runoff. They located the graves near midday, the wooden crosses Jackson had fashioned still standing, but weathered by months of exposure. The site appeared peaceful, surrounded by purple cone flowers and golden prairie sunflowers that nodded in the gentle breeze. Rebecca dismounted immediately, approaching the crosses with solemn respect. Together they worked through the afternoon, removing the temporary markers and installing the permanent headstones. Jackson dug deeper foundations to ensure the stones would stand against Montana's weather extremes, while Rebecca gathered wildflowers to place between the graves. When the physical labor was complete, they stood side by side before the final result. "Would you like a moment alone with them?" Jackson asked. Rebecca nodded, reaching into her saddlebag to withdraw her secret project, a wooden carving she had crafted herself under Jackson's occasional guidance. It depicted three figures: a man, a woman, and a child, standing together with hands linked. Though crude by adult standards, the carving displayed remarkable attention to detail for a 7-year-old's work. Jackson retreated to a respectful distance, tending the horses while Rebecca knelt between her parents' graves. He couldn't hear her words, but the intent posture of her small body suggested she was speaking to them, sharing news of her life and introducing the family that had taken her in. After several minutes, she placed her carving at the base of her mother's headstone, securing it with small stones to prevent the wind from claiming it. When she returned to Jackson, her expression was peaceful, the burden of unresolved grief visibly lightened. "I told them about you," she said simply, "about our home, about Thunder and Daisy and Mrs. Jenkins and Sarah, about school and the judge making it official that you're my guardian now." "I'm sure they were glad to hear it all," Jackson replied. Rebecca nodded. "I think they would like knowing I'm safe, that I have a family again." She hesitated, then added with childish directness, "I told them you're my father now, not just my guardian. Is that all right?" The question caught Jackson unprepared, stirring emotions he had carefully managed since making his impulsive vow in the snowdrift months earlier. Legal guardianship was one thing, a practical arrangement sanctioned by territorial authority. Father carried deeper implications, a relationship that transcended legal formalities to touch the heart of personal identity. "If that's how you see me," he said carefully, "then I'm honored by it." Rebecca studied his face with the penetrating gaze children sometimes possess. "You promised you'd be my father. The very first day, in the snow, remember?" "I remember." "Did you mean it then? Or just saying it because I was scared?" And alone, the directness of her question demanded equal honesty in response. Jackson considered his words carefully before answering. "When I found you, I made that promise without really understanding what it meant. I knew I had to keep you safe, get you warm. Beyond that, I wasn't thinking clearly." He paused, gathering thoughts that had been evolving over the months of their life together. "But now, after everything we've been through, I understand better. Being a father isn't just about protection or provision. It's about helping you grow into the person you're meant to become. About being there through good and hard times alike. About a bond that can't be broken by distance or even death." He gestured toward the graves. "Your parents will always be your parents. Nothing changes that. But if you want me to be your father too, in heart as well as law, then that's what I'll be, for as long as I live." Rebecca considered this, then nodded with the serious deliberation of a child making a lifelong decision. "I want that, and I'll be your daughter, not just your ward." "Then that's settled," Jackson said, his voice rougher than usual with suppressed emotion. They mounted their horses for the journey home, the afternoon sun warming their backs as they rode west. Behind them, two graves stood properly marked and honored, a chapter of life acknowledged and respected. Ahead lay the ranch, no longer simply Jackson's homestead, but their shared home, the foundation of a family rebuilt from tragedy's ashes. As the familiar silhouette of the cabin appeared on the horizon, Rebecca turned to Jackson with unexpected insight. "We needed each other, didn't we? Both of us were alone before the snow." Jackson considered the frozen man he had been in February, existing rather than living, haunted by failure, isolated by grief. The transformation of the past months had been as much his as hers, a mutual restoration neither could have achieved alone. "Reckon that's true," he acknowledged. "Seems sometimes the worst storms bring the greatest gifts." They rode the final distance in companionable silence, father and daughter returning to the home they now fully shared, the promised relationship forged in winter's adversity now flowering in summer's abundance. A second chance neither had expected, but both had embraced with courage and faith that transcended bloodlines to create a family bound by choice rather than circumstance.